Hello again. I'm back. I'm still Mary Louise Kelly and still at the Atlantic. And this next conversation, we've heard from many people up here on stage today who accept marriage equality as the new normal. Many people who believe that federal anti-discrimination laws like the Equality Act are a logical and necessary next step. And in this next conversation, we're going to hear a different point of view from someone who is asking, do civil rights for some get in the way of civil liberties for others? Ryan Anderson, welcome. You research marriage, religion, and public policy at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much
Thanks for having me.
For stopping by
here.
to talk. Let me start. I mentioned the Equality Act, which at this point we should note is still a bill, but if passed would amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to ban discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender. Now, you, I gather, are not a fan of the Equality Act. You oppose discrimination, agree that we should all oppose discrimination, but you say the Equality Act is not the best way to do it. Why not?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, is that the Equality Act is a problem because it stigmatizes certain viewpoints in the United States, that we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other in marriage, as if that belief system is unjust discrimination akin to racism. Now, obviously, in this theater, we disagree about that belief. I think that belief is true. Many people in the theater probably believe it's false. I'm not interested in having the government criminalize it by making it illegal to act out on that belief in a commercial setting, in a housing setting, in an educational setting. What the Equality Act would do is more or less render a belief that's common to all of the Abrahamic faith traditions. So Orthodox Jews, Roman Catholics, evangelical Christians, Latter-day Saints, and many other people who share that belief system wouldn't be able to live it out at their workplace, at their school, at their charity. And I say that part of freedom is going to have to be the right to disagree about the truth. And so gays and lesbians need to be free to live and love how they want to, but other people need to be free to live and to work and to run schools and charities in accordance with their beliefs. It needs to be a two-way street.
And you frame this as religious beliefs that you feel may be impinged on by legislation.
Well, also philosophical beliefs. I mean, I think this viewpoint is common to the great Greek and Roman philosophers as well. So you'll find Aristotle, Plato, Cicero. You don't need to be religious to believe that we come male and female and that male and female are meant for each other. But it is true that most of the major world religions share that belief system.
Is there any way you can imagine, you object to the specific legislation that's on the table, is there any way you can imagine it being written where rights of minorities, the LGBT community, could be enshrined, could be protected under law that you would not object to, that would not impinge on?
I haven't seen a version of that yet that I could kind of agree to. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but so far I don't think we've seen any legislative models that could be replicated. And partly because, unlike the case of racism, I can't think of any plausible argument whatsoever that would say someone's skin color matters in that sort of a way, right? I mean, to say that your ethnic heritage, your racial identity, your skin color would justify someone's belief about the wedding cake, the flowers, the adoption situation. Whereas whether you agree or disagree with the baker, the florist, the photographer, whether you agree or disagree with the Catholic Charity Adoption Agency, you really can't deny that there are plausible reasons that male and female matter for the institution of marriage and that mother and father matter for child rearing. And you can think they're wrong about that, but you can't seriously deny that it's just the result of irrational animus and bigotry, in the way that I think we do have to say that for racism, it really is just the result of irrational animus and bigotry. There's no plausible argument to justify it whatsoever.
Let me ask just a couple of basic questions, because I want to make sure I understand exactly where your views are on the big picture on this. Do you believe that members of the LGBT community are entitled to the same protections, the same privileges under the Constitution as you, as anybody else?
Oh, of course, yeah. So I think all human beings have innate intrinsic dignity, need to be protected in law on an equal basis. My only hesitation here is about whether or not we want to elevate sexual orientation and gender identity to a protected class, because that goes beyond equal treatment under the law into signaling out a particular identity, a particular character trait that would now be gaining extra protections in the law. And it strikes me that that's the problem. What we want here is equality under the law, not creating a special category for a protected class.
I guess the practical question, though, is that members of this community, whatever the law says, feel that they have not and have not been treated in an equal manner. You mentioned, the caterer, the florist who says, I don't want to serve you. What protections would you advocate, could you support?
Sure.
If we agree that this community is not having an equal experience in this country, what should we do about it?
So I don't deny that bigotry exists, but I don't think the baker, the florist, or the photographer are acting out of a bigoted viewpoint in that situation. I mean, I think that's where we're going to have to agree to disagree. So it would be one thing if we had a situation in which someone says, I refuse to serve lunch to someone because they're gay or lesbian. It's a radically different situation.
They're refusing to bake a cake for someone.
Right, and I think, so take the example of Baronelle Stutzman. Here you have a 71-year-old grandmother. She's a florist. She's had gay employees. She has no problem employing gay people. She was selling flowers to this particular gay couple for over a decade. She has no problem doing get well soon flowers, happy birthday flowers. It was when they asked for the wedding flowers that she said, I can't do that. Now, whether you as the florist would do the same-sex wedding flowers or not, I think is irrelevant to this conversation. I think in a free society, we say we protect her right to run her business in accordance with the belief that marriage is the union of a man and a woman. And there are plenty of other florists who are interested in making money and are interested in doing same-sex weddings. And what I would suggest the protections here would be market competition. I think already 89% of Fortune 500 companies have voluntarily enacted non-discrimination statutes on the basis of sexual orientation. This is working its way out on a voluntary basis. Why would anyone want to discriminate against good employees just for the sake of being a jerk? I just don't see that as raising to the level of needing federal legislation. That's a very blunt instrument. It's not a finely tuned, finely crafted mechanism for fixing these problems.
Well, but let me push back on that with a couple of questions. One is, if we rely on market forces to regulate this and to achieve the right end, I mean, market forces did not integrate the lunch counters of the Deep South. They did not succeed at getting blacks and whites able to ride the same bus. Do you think that's a false?
Oh yeah, I think that analogy is historically inaccurate.
Okay,
I think it's offensive to many black people. I don't think the situation of a gay or a lesbian in the United States today is remotely similar.
I'm not trying to be offensive to anybody. I'm just saying that there's certain things that the market hasn't achieved that we've relied on legislation in the courts to
But my
achieve.
point is that what you need to do to justify government intervention is to say that it's not working its way out. So being African American in the South in the 1960s is radically different than being gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender in the United States today. The day of the Obergefell decision from the Supreme Court, the White House was lit up in rainbow colors. Every prominent member of the Democratic Party is in favor of LGBT legislation. Most prominent, 89% of the Fortune 500 companies voluntarily have enacted these protections. I don't think you could make an argument to say that's the same situation that African Americans found themselves in the 60s. So that's what justified the Civil Rights Act of '64, which said government needs to step in to fix a problem that's not being solved at a voluntary basis. What I see here is that if you're a conservative evangelical at a major law firm or at an Ivy League university, you have a much harder time coming out of the closet as a conservative evangelical than you do coming out as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. That's an empirical question, but my experience at Princeton, and that was a decade ago that I was there, was that it was much more contentious subject to say that you were opposed to same-sex marriage than to say that you were in favor of it.
That I will buy. How do you balance? I mean, we're in a democracy. We're in the 21st century. Inevitably, in a democracy, the rights of one group are going to sometimes conflict with the rights of another group. How do you think about balancing? I mean, just to return to this example, because it's one we can all picture of the cake baker or the florist who doesn't want to do flowers for a gay couple's weddings. And I take your point about that would violate her religious beliefs. On the other hand, it violates the belief of this couple that they deserve to be treated equally and be served where they want to be served. How do you balance those competing rights? I mean, democracy is messy. It's part of what makes it beautiful.
So I think that rather than thinking of it as a balancing of rights, I say everyone should have equal rights, which would be the baker is free to bake cakes in accordance with her beliefs, and the same-sex couple is free to get whatever cake they want from whatever bakery wants to bake them that cake. So this happened to me just, a week ago. I was in Bermuda. I was scheduled to speak at several public fora about marriage. And the week before I arrived, the hotel that had already agreed to host these 2 public lectures canceled on the group that was sponsoring it. It said, we don't sponsor, the exact phrase was anti-diversity speech. Now, my position is that if it's their sincere religious belief or their sincere moral conviction that the people who believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman and who seek to educate the public about this are anti-diversity people, and that goes against their belief system, then in a free country, they should be free to run their hotel in accordance with that belief. My right to speech, free speech right, doesn't mean anyone else needs to give me a podium or write a speech for me.
So do you disagree with the hotel's decision? Should they have served you?
So, I mean, I think that if you're going to be a hotel who hosts public events, like this theater, I would tend to think that what you want to do is find the best speakers on all sides of events. One week a hotel hosts the RNC convention, the next week the DNC convention. But I'm not going to force them to do this. So I think they have a right to do the wrong thing. So I think it's probably the wrong thing to not be willing to host a talk that
so you don't
with.
think this hotel should be legally compelled to host
I would not file a lawsuit to sue them. I mean, there's actually a question because hotels are kind of quintessential public accommodations under public accommodation law in a way that bakeries aren't. But I personally would not file a lawsuit like that because I say freedom's a two-way street. You're free to bake the cake or not. You're free to host the talk or not.
So, I mean, you allude to the whole accommodation rule, and you're referring, I'm sure, to the Supreme Court, which, as you know, struck down when it was striking down segregationist ordinances in the Deep South, said some businesses are public accommodations. That means even if they're privately owned and run, they warrant a degree of public supervision. I mean, basically, they said they need to be forced to serve somebody they don't want to serve.
And what's interesting is that in the Civil Rights Act of '64, it was defined much more narrowly than what the Equality Act would do. So the Civil Rights Act of '64 defines it to places like hotels and hospitals and gas stations and theaters like this one, but not to bakeries or florist studios or photography studios. It would be a public accommodation was something that was more like an essential service or a component of public life like a theater. So you could see how a hospital, a hotel, a gas station would fit that description in a way that a boutique cake baking shop wouldn't. And yet what we see now with the state, the local, and the federal anti-discrimination acts, they're actually broadening that definition to include all places of employment. So the Houston HERO Ordinance and the federal Equality Act say more or less all places of business are public accommodations that are open to the public. So any store that has a storefront is now a public accommodation. Which is drastically larger.
You would disagree with that. There's lots more I want to ask you, but I want to give our audience a chance too. We have microphones out there. We will bring them to you. I appreciate your listening with an open mind to views that I know some of you may disagree with. So if I could ask you to actually ask a question, that would be great. If you have a speech to give, Ryan would love to hear it afterward, but I will cut you off. Yes, sir.
I'm Rick Rosendahl, and I want to ask with regard to male-female complementarity, and you mentioned philosophical tradition and Plato. Are you familiar with Plato's symposium where his creation myth includes some people's other half being same-sex and some people's other half being the opposite sex, which refutes your claim about tradition in Plato?
Well, no, actually, I don't think it refutes that claim. Sorry, I read the symposium and most other of the Platonic dialogues in graduate school. So my PhD is in political philosophy. I'm familiar with this. But what's remarkable about Plato is that even while he was in favor of, in certain contexts, same-sex sexual acts and same-sex sexual relationships, he never thought they were marital. So I don't think your opinion of the morality of gay and lesbian relationships has any implications for what sort of a relationship a marriage is. This is one of the points that my co-authors and I make in the first book that I wrote, What is Marriage? Is that there are two different questions here. One question is, what's the status of same-sex relationships, moral, immoral, neutral, however you want to think about that. The other question is, what sort of a consenting adult relationship is a marriage? And so Plato answered that first question. In certain contexts, same-sex relationships are morally acceptable, and yet he didn't think they were marriages. And that's just a historical, it's an interesting fact about ancient Greece, and actually Justice Alito mentioned it during the oral arguments under Obergefell.
Thank you. Another question. See, we're back here. Thank you. And then we've got one in the second row up here if we have time too. Yes, back here. Thanks.
Oh, it's me.
Hi.
I'm Brian Simmons. I'm Vice President of Communications at the Arcus Foundation.
Hi.
The baker and the florist have come up a couple of times today in some really interesting sort of recurring analogies. And I was listening earlier this morning and thinking about a time when Black Americans had a sort of book that used to circulate so you could sort of shop for a hotel where you could sleep. And it was suggested by a speaker earlier today that LGBT people might shop for a florist, and I think you made the same suggestion. And I'm leading up to my question, which is a lot of these analogies feel a bit, they feel strange to me. You also mentioned that the florist might have gay employees, just has a problem baking the cake for the wedding. But that evoked for me an image that I recall from the book and the movie The Help, and even the stories from my own family about the white employer who has the black maid who comes in the back door but can't come in the front door, who might have a business where they won't serve dark people. So my question is, do you ever struggle with the integrity of these analogies? You seem to have accepted them. Others who spoke earlier today did. But do you recognize an arguable strain in these analogies?
Oh, of course. Every analogy is arguable. I mean, that's the entire point. It's not a univocal predication. It's an analogical predication. So analogies aren't similar in every aspect or every respect. They're similar in certain aspects. So one way where I think the analogy breaks down is that I do not think sexual orientation and gender identity are the same thing as race. So I think it's a problem when you compare the anti-discrimination laws and the civil rights laws that we rightly passed to protect against racism to a different debate, which is about sexual orientation and gender identity. So I think that those are disanalogous situations. But I do think there could be something similar to that. You had racists who were like, well, but I'm not the worst racist in the world because I allow some of my lighter-skinned black servants to come in, but only through the back door, not the front door. I still think that's a form of racism. I don't think it's legitimate to say that anyone who believes, whether it's for philosophical or religious reasons, that sexual complementarity is something that's unique and important in human life, that the union of a man and a woman can create new life, and that children deserve a mom and a dad. I don't want to equate that viewpoint with irrational bigotry, even if you disagree with that viewpoint. I mean, I think the big question now after Obergefell is, how do we live as a society with disparate views about the nature of marriage and the nature of human sexuality? Do we want to impose a orthodoxy for the entire nation enforceable by law, or do we want to let this solve itself out by saying diversity and pluralism and tolerance is really the best of the American tradition? And so you can agree to disagree. And peaceful coexistence is acknowledging that there are going to be people who disagree with you, and they still have the right to think what they think and live their lives in accordance with those beliefs. It strikes me that after the Supreme Court's decision, we need to find a solution like that, because I don't see Orthodox Jews or Roman Catholics or evangelicals or Mormons changing their belief system overnight on this issue. And I think it would be a mistake if the government tried to do that under the penalty of law.
Thank you. There's a question right here. Yes, ma'am.
So you stated that you have issue with LGBT special protections, but freedom is another issue. How do you feel about religious freedom legislation? Would you argue that that is also a form of special protection? Do you feel that that is something that should be separate from? How do you make that argument?
Yeah, so I mean, I think here you just go back to Madison. Look at Madison's Moral Remonstrance, and Madison says that the reason why religion is a liberty amongst men is because there's the duty that takes precedent to civil society, and that's the duty that every individual owes to a creator, how he or she understands the nature of that creator and the nature of that duty. So in the Memorial and Remonstrance, Madison is arguing that the reason why religious liberty is a natural right, so before it's even a civil right, it's a natural right, is that it places limits on what actually belongs to the government. So you think Jesus says, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, render to the gods the things that are gods. Madison's saying that means there's certain things that aren't Caesar's, and so that the government can't coerce religious action, they can't place undue burdens on religious practice. So we've seen this play out in the United States in a host of ways. Pacifists don't have to serve in the military. We say that the government can't force you into armed service if it violates your religious belief that you think you have a duty to the creator not to bear arms. We've said, take the example of a pro-life doctor. You don't have to perform an abortion if it violates your beliefs. So even after Roe v. Wade, we says, women have a right to have an abortion, but that doesn't mean that someone else has to necessarily perform the abortion. That's a limit on what government can do. So I think all that's happening there is that we're limiting government legislation. But I think in the sexual orientation and gender identity context, is you're saying we want a law that's going to force someone else to do something, whereas in the religious liberty context, you're just saying we want something that's going to limit the government from doing something to a citizen that goes against their beliefs. And I think that's going to be consistent. I think gay and lesbian people who are religious should have the same exact religious liberty rights. So if your church wants to perform a marriage, even before the civil definition of marriage was changed, they should be free to have a religious ceremony. I mean, I would have been astounded had there been a government that tried to say a liberal church or synagogue or mosque couldn't do a same-sex wedding ceremony. But I think the flip side now means that if you don't want to do it, you shouldn't have to do it. And if you don't want to do a same-sex adoption, you think kids deserve a mom and a dad, there's no reason for the government to be shutting down Catholic charity adoption agencies, especially when that doesn't serve children. We want as many different adoption agencies as possible to be out there working for children. So I just think here what we want to do is embrace a pluralistic outlook that says everyone should be free to live in accordance with their beliefs, provided they don't violate the rights of others.
Ryan Anderson, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right off this way.